I'm here at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, where Albert Einstein both taught and worked. Einstein's thinking contributed to the modern philosophy of life. By breaking with the past and discarding their connections with traditional religion and the God of Judeo-Christian theology, modern humanity turned to the machine and technology for meaning.
But science and technology could not answer the questions raised by artists like Paul Gauguin. Modern man has a sense of absurdity and futility, which comes from his belief that there are no certainties in life, that everything is relative.
One step on the road toward modern man's acceptance of moral relativism was almost accidental. On May 29, 1919, Albert Einstein seemed to scientifically reduce the concept of moral absolutes to irrelevance.
Einstein's theory of general relativity describes the workings of gravity and its effects on space and time. The solar eclipse, which occurred on May 29, 1919, gave evidence that a large gravitational force can distort the very shape of space and can even warp time. Einstein's theory was called relativity because it replaced the idea that time and space are absolute with the idea that observations of time and space depend upon the position and the state of motion of the observer. Einstein's idea aroused worldwide interest as it replaced the older theories of Isaac Newton. Newton's ordered and predictable universe suddenly became uncertain and relative.
Relativity, however, became confused with relativism. Many believed that somehow Einstein had proved that there were no absolutes even in the moral realm. Eventually, the idea of moral relativism cut society adrift from the faith and the morals of Judeo-Christian society. The idea of moral relativism soon began to invade the area of sexual ethics. Some early 20th century leaders sought to eradicate certain traditional ideas about morality. One such person was the sex education pioneer Margaret Sangor, who died in 1966.
Margaret Sangor was determined that women should not suffer ill health and death like her mother had from numerous pregnancies. Sangor championed the cause of contraception and sex education for women. She did not, however, advocate abortion. She believed that contraception would eliminate the need for abortion. Sangor also believed that sexual freedom should be available to women as well as men. Although Margaret Sangor began her crusade as a defender of the rights of women and the working class, Sangor understood that she could strike a more sympathetic chord with lawmakers on the theme of eugenics. Eugenics was a science of the selective breeding of human beings to produce a so-called better humanity. Ideas about eugenics eventually became popular in Europe, as well as the United States. As Margaret Sangor wrote, "More children from the fit, less from the unfit." By the unfit, Sangor clearly meant minority Americans as well as retarded children and other so-called undesirables. Although Sangor tried to avoid overt racism, her eugenic propaganda attracted a wide audience of mostly white American workers, to whom she appealed because of the racism inherent in eugenics.
And every working man knows that it is far better and easier to bring 2 children into the world and provide for them decently on the average wage of $35 a week than it is to have 8 or 10 children on the same wage.
Besides the scientific and sexual revolutions, there were other vast changes taking place in the 1920s. Art, and especially music, were part of the new spirit of the age. Jazz was emerging around 1913. Jazz was spontaneous and free of the musical traditions that had preceded it. Jazz challenged traditional music much as Margaret Sangor and others challenged the older established sexual ethics.
Jazz was thought to be the creation of so-called primitive people who had not been repressed by the rules of civilization. Jazz liberated the individual musician to perform whatever music spontaneously came to mind. The point was to be free of all constraint. Coinciding with emerging feminism, the jazz age became known as both the age of musical and sexual freedom. This climate produced a medium in which some of America's greatest musical talents were able to express their creative genius. Louis Armstrong is acknowledged to be the greatest of all jazz solo revolutionaries. The Hot Five series, the Hot Five being the 5 members of Armstrong's band, recorded 2 instant classics, Heebie-Jeebies and Cornet Chop Suey. Heebie-Jeebies is believed to be the first improvised vocal.
Come on down to that dance. They call it heebie-jeebies dance. Sweet mama, 1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on. Join me home. We'll have some fun.
In the new age of personal freedom, even jazz was too tame a form of music. Something less inhibited would soon take its place. Rock and roll was the perfect next step. In rock and roll, the American public found the ideal vehicle for pure entertainment. Rock and roll provided the ultimate feel-good beat for a generation hooked on the materialistic values of Hollywood. Bill Haley and the Comets, along with many other rock bands, eventually began to rival movie stars as cultural icons.
Rock and roll exploded onto Western culture with surprising speed. One reason for its quick acceptance was the bridge provided by many talented black musicians, including the Washboard Serenaders and the highly innovative Harlem Hamfats. The melody was simple. It was rhythmically direct, and often the lyrics were humorous and erotic, such as in the tune Let's Get Drunk and Truck, which was a popular dance tune at the time. During the 1950s, rock and roll became widely popular due to its exposure by radio. Disc jockey Bill Haley brought rock and roll to vast new audiences.
Several decades before the onslaught of rock and roll, serious artists and philosophers attempted to introduce notions of rebellion, especially against Western culture, into the realm of high art. For example, in 1925, the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset argued in his landmark book, The Dehumanization of Art, that rebellion against the older forms of art was the only way to create anything new. At about the same time that Gasset was writing about smashing the older artistic conventions, artists like Marcel Duchamp were indeed attacking the traditional view of art and life in such works as Duchamp's The Large Glass, which he completed in 1923. Like Gasset, Duchamp believed that artists should dehumanize their work.
Gasset believed that since traditional art made life its main subject, modern artists must attempt to dehumanize their work. Hostile toward life and tradition, the artists, Gasset believed, must also hate art, science, state, and civilization as a whole. Artists soon began to create a new art, that most people did not understand and even despised. This new art became known as modern art. Gosset predicted that modern art would separate society into two categories: the elite, in other words, the class that understood the art, and the masses, those who did not. Besides modern art, other events, such as the U.S. stock market crash on October 29, 1929, began to undermine any sense of stability in the Western world. As a result of the crash, people began to look for a radical alternative to Western capitalism, religion, and society. Many Westerners, particularly intellectuals and artists, embraced communism.
Pablo Picasso was typical of the intellectual elite of his day. He was a leftist who described himself as a communist. However, as a great artist, Picasso could empathize with the suffering brought on by the inhumanity of modern society. Picasso's 1937 painting Guernica captured the political climate of upheaval and social disintegration perfectly.
Guernica was inspired by the bombing of a Basque town during the Spanish Civil War. German bombers destroyed Guernica at the request of Spanish National Commander General Mola. The painting's images have become universal symbols of bitter wartime affliction and the rise of right-wing fascist governments in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. Broken warriors at the base of the composition. A woman with a dead child. A disemboweled horse at the center with a spear-point tongue. All became symbols of the conscience of a horrified humanity. By the mid-1930s, many European governments had moved to the right, while the communist state of the Soviet Union under Stalin moved to the totalitarian left. It was an age of extremes, and these extremes were on display in Germany, where both the left and right battled for cultural supremacy.
Just as Paris had been the center of culture of the late 19th century, in the 1920s, Berlin became the focus of the cultural world. Germany's claim to dominance was an art movement known as the Bauhaus.
Architect Walter Gropius inaugurated the Bauhaus in 1919. The Bauhaus became the major leader in the art of design and architecture. The Bauhaus was reminiscent of medieval craft guilds, which once housed the masons and designers of medieval cathedrals. The Bauhaus suggested a society of craftsmen devoted to heroic and idealistic projects. However, the ideology of the Bauhaus was far from traditional. It was definitely modernist in its viewpoint. In his utopian desire to create a new guild of craftsmen without class distinctions, Gropius wanted to construct the new structures of the future, which, as he said, would one day rise toward heaven from the hands of 1 million workers, like the crystal symbol of a new fate.
The Bauhaus addressed everyday practical questions such as mass housing, industrial design, layout, photography, and the development of household wares. The students and staff at the Bauhaus designed household items, lamps, furniture, pottery, and kitchenwares, but they refused to put their efforts at the service of the politicians.
The Bauhaus craftsmen believed they could create a new consciousness through innovative design. On the way to this utopia, however, their idealism soon ran into an impenetrable roadblock. Less than 3 months after he came to power, Hitler closed the Bauhaus, proclaiming it one of the most obvious Jewish Marxist corruptions of art.
Hitler may have disagreed with the philosophy and the politics of the Bauhaus artists, but he understood the importance and the power of art and architecture nonetheless.
In 1925, Hitler was already sketching giant domes and arches for a rebuilt Berlin to be the capital of the world. The fact that Hitler was dreaming of great architectural creations years before he came to power proved that he understood the power of design to convey political ideas. Hitler's architectural message was that of centralized power, in which the individual is dwarfed by the state. Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, like Italian fascist Benito Mussolini, believed that authoritarian architecture must be massive and impenetrable, as shown in his vision of the Berlin Dome and Mussolini's Palace of Civilization. Ironically, in the America of 1950, this style became known as the architecture of democracy.
Authoritarian and fascist styles, such as those of Albert Speer and Mussolini, became the reigning styles in cultural centers, civic buildings, and even appeared on many American university campuses, particularly in Southern California. The Empire State Plaza behind me here, which is commonly called the Albany Mall, which is also the seat of the power of the state of New York, is a good example. It's strikingly similar to Mussolini's Palace of Civilization. The Albany Mall is a temple, more or less, dedicated to modern art and modern architecture in all its dehumanizing aspects. The question raised here is, where do human beings fit in all of this?
The mall shows the similarities between the corporate and bureaucratic states of mind of so-called democratic and authoritarian states, irrespective of country or ideology. One could see these buildings with an eagle on top, or a swastika, or a hammer and sickle. It makes no difference to the building. Irrespective of nationality, this architectural style projects the faceless power of the state over the individual.
The Bauhaus designers of the 1920s and Hitler and Mussolini were not the only leaders of the 1930s and 40s who understood the usefulness of art as a political asset and as a tool for social propaganda. As part of his program to put America back to work after the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt provided federal funding for thousands of paintings, frescoes, posters, photographs, and murals, such as the one by William Gropper behind me here at the Department of Interior in Washington, D.C. Roosevelt deeply imprinted a Depression-era America with the nobility of working-class socialism and patriotism. Soon, museums would replace churches as the focal point of a society that had become increasingly secular and uncomfortable with traditional religion. A good example is the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which stands here behind me, which looks more like a temple of worship than a place where works of art would be stored. It is no coincidence that museums began to look like temples.
Besides the museums, other cultural events began to shape ideas the way religion once had. Technological and industrial forces, including press, camera, film, radio, theater, and record, began to dominate the popular arts. Men and women increasingly learned to view reality through the lens of a camera. For example, in the late 1930s, for every British person who bought a daily newspaper, 2 bought a cinema ticket. As Europe appeared to be falling inexorably into fascism during the early days of World War II, America waged a bitter domestic battle between interventionists and isolationists, with President Roosevelt unable to gain national support for his interventionist policy.
May those of you who intend a solution.
A swing toward American isolationism would have jeopardized Europe and ensured the triumph of fascism abroad.
In the work of advancing to a
The great American filmmaker Orson Welles portrayed America's anxiety about entering World War II in the now classic film Citizen Kane, completed in 1941. Citizen Kane was really Orson Welles' expression of his concern about America's isolationism in a cinematic metaphor.
You're going to live with Mr. Thatcher from now on, Charlie. You're going to be rich. Your ma figures, well, that is, me and her decided this ain't the place for you to grow up in.
In the beginning of the film, Kane is forced to leave the old world environment of his family's poverty-stricken cottage. Later, Kane is portrayed as a huge, brooding figure, an icon of American capitalism, isolated in his fantasy castle, built with ill-gotten gains from Europe.
After World War II, America faced new levels of alienation and uncertainty. Edward Hopper's 1942 painting Nighthawks perfectly captures the alienation and loneliness of modern American life. The shadowed, hollowed eyes of the diner's customers against the backdrop of a dark and haunted city in this painting represents the soullessness of contemporary life. Humanity is swallowed in the blankness of modernity. This uncertainty is also portrayed in Sloan Wilson's 1955 novel, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit.
The book was made into a film starring Gregory Peck in 1956. As Tom Rath, the main character, tries to explain to his wife, one day a man's catching the 826, and the next day he's killing people, and the next he's catching the 826 again. Rath concludes that the only way to survive is to believe the world is disconnected. What was true yesterday is not necessarily true today.
Nothing illustrates the mid-century mood of alienation and despair better than the work of the abstract expressionist artist. Jackson Pollock was one of the most prominent of these artists. This is his painting, Autumn Rhythm No. 30, which he completed in 1950. This canvas, which hangs here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, is typical of a series of abstract expressionist works known as action paintings. Pollock would cover huge canvases like this one by splattering and dropping the paint and the colors instead of using brushes.
Jackson Pollock is credited with developing the so-called drip method. Canvases were walked on, torn and dragged to produce random, totally abstract images that seemed to perfectly convey the modern American theme of alienation, not only from the past, but also from reality itself.
Irish-born Francis Bacon painted the alienation and dehumanization of culture. Some of his most powerful works are these paintings called Three Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion, which Bacon painted in 1944. Bacon surpassed artists such as Jackson Pollock in his representation of the human form. Pollock was content to paint in a purely abstract style, but Francis Bacon revived figurative painting only to visually destroy his subjects.
Bacon painted man's lonely cry for his lost values and lost humanity, and for a humanity deprived of freedom, love, and rationality. His Three Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion epitomize the spirit of 20th century man, grasping for lost truths in a world devoid of meaning. Bacon's human corpses, his figures of Christ hung like beef in a butcher's shop, show a belief in the absolute mortality of man without hope of redemption. An atheist, Bacon was ironically one of the most deeply religious painters of the century, in the sense that the spiritual agony of his work evokes a religious response.
Bacon combined the major themes of his time: alienation, dehumanization, and pessimism. No one has better depicted the despair of the generations who lived between the early 1900s and the late 1950s. The 20th century generation had sown rebellion and reaped chaos. Albert Einstein introduced relativity, and the world reaped relativism. The philosophers like Gasset divided the masses from the elites. Even as people tried to understand their alienation and loss of hope, they learned that the artists and philosophers had few real and lasting answers. Western culture was lost, and Bacon provided its epitaph. "Of course we are meat," he said. "We are potential carcasses."